Good evening. Welcome to this panel to discuss Russia's frozen assets. I'm Simon Nixon. I'm an independent commentator and publisher of the Wealth of Nations newsletter, which you can find on Substack. It's a great joy for me to interview Hugo Dixon, my friend and former colleague, a very distinguished commentator in his own right, commentator at large for Reuters, formerly founder of Breaking Views, now Reuters Breaking Views, and author of has done a lot of work on the Russian frozen assets and how to deal with them. Just to set the scene, by the end of last year, there were an estimated 176 billion of dollars worth of damage had been done to Ukraine as a result of the war. The cost of recovery and reconstruction is estimated to be $524 billion. That's twice the GDP of Greece, 60% of the Next Generation EU funding program. So it's a vast amount of money needed to restore Greece, and on top of which 30% of the Ukrainian land territory is now covered in minefields, which will need to be removed. So enormous funding requirements, and $300 billion roughly of Russian assets that have been sitting frozen in the financial systems of the West for the last 3 years. So, Hugo, I mean, firstly, maybe just before we get to your plan, let me just set the scene. Why have these assets not been seized already? Why are they sitting there?
Well, most of them are in the EU. The vast majority are in Belgium. Up till now, the EU countries have been scared of seizing them because they haven't seen a good legal basis for doing that. And although some people think that actually just confiscating them because Russia has invaded is a sufficient legal basis. And the second reason is that they've been scared that perhaps if they did that, then international investors, particularly China and Gulf investors such as Saudi, would desert the euro. So those have been the two main reasons. There have been, under the Biden administration, Biden was okay for seizing them. The British have been okay for seizing them. The Canadians have been okay. But, I mean, the British have some, but not much in America. And so ultimately, it's a European decision, a European Union decision, and the countries within the European Union that are sitting on those assets, principally Belgium, France, and Germany.
Very good. So just on the seizing, it always struck me as a bit, the Americans could have seized them unilaterally at any point if they wanted to set an example. But you have come up with a proposal for a reparation loan that is very interesting and potentially circumvents some of these concerns. So do you want to explain how your idea would work?
Just more or less there have been two camps. There have been those who say, Russia's invaded, Ukraine needs the money, let's seize the assets and give it to Ukraine, and those who say we can't do that because the legal basis, which is so-called countermeasures, that in a war, if one country does something illegal, then you can do things in return which would otherwise have normally been illegal, but because it's in a war and they've done something to you, it's a sort of tit-for-tat is justified. The problem with the countermeasures, there are two problems with the countermeasures doctrine. I'm not a lawyer, but there are two problems with it. One is that Russia has invaded Ukraine. It's at war with Ukraine. It's not at war with Europe. If Ukraine was sitting on the assets, of course it would just seize the assets, finito. The second problem is that the countermeasures doctrine is supposed to be used on a temporary basis until such a point when the invader reverses their action. The problem with seizing the assets and giving them all the way to Ukraine is that it's slightly difficult to see how you're ever going to get them back from Ukraine and give them to Russia if Russia changes its mind. Anyway, that's where those are the sort of two sort of rival camps. And so what we've done, and this is with Lee Buchheit, who many of the Greeks in the audience will know because he helped restructure the Greek sovereign debt and is probably the top sovereign debt lawyer in the world, he and I came up with this alternative idea, which we called the reparation loan. And the reparation loan simply is that the West lends the $300 billion to Ukraine. In return, Ukraine pledges as collateral its claim against Russia for war damages, for reparations. When Russia refuses to pay those war damages, the lenders inherit the collateral, which is the claim against Russia, and they say, well, you owe us money, but you're not paying it. We're sitting on your assets. We set one off against the other, and that's like an internal bookkeeping operation. And so that is a completely different legal basis from the confiscation idea. It's based on two well-established legal principles. One is that if you illegally damage another country, you have to pay reparations. And the second is the common banking legal principle of set-off, that if someone owes you money and you happen to hold their assets, you can just do that internal bookkeeping transaction. So it's a much more solid legal basis. And so that's this idea that we put forward last year. And we got somewhere with the US administration was up for it, and the Brits and the Canadians. But now I think we've got another opportunity, because Trump has come in. Ironically, it means that it actually has a better chance, because the continental Europeans who were against it in the past may now be in favor of it.
Right. Just to understand the mechanics, you would have a these wouldn't be bilateral loans. It would be similar to the loan that was done using the interest on the frozen asset. It would be a G7 type loan, but with everybody pledging the.
Well, it could be. I mean, there are various different ways you could do it. And so, Simon, you're referring to the fact that already the G7 has siphoned off the interest on some of these assets and capitalized that in a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. And that was sort of happened last year, and it's been sort of lent out. And that's a syndication. It's basically a syndication of the G7. That could be one option. The way that I see it, the most likely mechanism, it seems to me, is that the EU makes a loan from the main loan comes from the EU. The UK makes its loan, and any other country that wants to be part of it make their loan. But the EU as a collective makes the loan, and that has an advantage, which is that the loan would not go onto the balance sheet of any of the individual member states, and so that wouldn't blow up their debt ratios.
And who needs to be brought on side? Presumably Belgium needs to be brought on side because they have most of the assets.
Yes, Belgium needs to be brought on side, France needs to be brought on side, and Germany needs to be brought on side. Olaf Scholz was very much opposed to doing anything with these frozen assets, and there was a dinner at NATO, I think just before Christmas, where the Poles brought up the idea, and he went ballistic. But he's out. Friedrich Merz has indicated that he's interested in our idea, so that's a big change. Macron is not yet convinced, but we're working on it. I have a little group, and a multinational group, and we're working on all the key capitals. And my view is that if we can get both Merz and Macron, and then the other key thing is the ECB, the European Central Bank, because Christine Lagarde was opposed to confiscation, but she's not been opposed to this particular idea. She's not, on the other hand, she hasn't said she loves it. She hasn't said anything about it. What she did say, though, was rather cryptically a few weeks ago. Is she said that if anybody did, if it wasn't for the ECB to have a view about this, but she was sure that if they did something with these assets, if the governments did something with these assets, it would be done in a properly legal form. And my view is, well, fantastic. We have got the legal mechanism for you, Christine Lagarde. And so I think my view is that if you can get those on board, Lagarde, Macron, and Merz, then I think we'll find a way of getting the Belgians on board. And then the question is, can we get Trump on board,
well, exactly.
Or do we need Trump?
Do you need Trump?
Well, Well, a few weeks ago, I would have said it was highly desirable to have Trump, even though the Americans only are sitting on $5 billion of these assets. Having them all together is an advantage, because one of the counter-arguments for not doing anything with these assets is, quite apart from the legality, is that that might scare off international investors. But frankly, Trump is doing an extremely good job of tanking the dollar. And the idea that the Chinese are going to say, oh, we're going to sell our euros and buy dollars because you have lent some money to Russia because of their illegal invasion of Ukraine, I mean, it seems to me rather fanciful. So I'm much less worried about the need to get Trump on board. I think it would be nice to get Trump on board. As you know, a couple of weeks ago, he said he was pissed off that Putin was dragging his feet on a ceasefire. And you may have seen that today he put out another one of his social media messages saying something like, hurry up, too many people are dying. So he is a bit impatient, and there is always a chance that Trump will be willing to turn the screws on Putin. So it would be best to have him together. But honestly, we can't wait. And Europe should just get its act together, and it should. And to be clear, it's not as if you'd give the full 300 billion to Ukraine in one whole slew. What you do is you give tranches. Maybe you give 40 billion or 50 billion every 6 months. And so this could be quite good. You prepare to give the 50 billion. If, before you've actually lent the 50 billion, if Putin agrees to a ceasefire, you could pause the loan. If he doesn't agree a ceasefire, you make the loan. If he makes the ceasefire and then he breaks it, then you make another loan. And so this is also this, it seems to me, is one of the things that gets Europe into the game. Europe has been far too weak on Ukraine, and as a result, Trump has felt that he can cut his own deal directly with Putin while ignoring Europe. But, okay, now we've seen these talks between Starmer and Macron and trying to find a way of providing a backstop, a military backstop. Now, that could be one way that Europe gets in the game. But as we've seen, we've had talks after talks after talks, and they don't seem to have been able to get very far with that, partly because they need Trump's support. Now, this is something that the Europeans can do unilaterally without American support. It'd be nice to have American support, but they don't need American support in the same way that they do need American support to put troops into Ukraine.
You've implicitly answered a question that was on my mind already, but I'm going to ask it, which is that you see this money, this loan being done now. Not, I mean, is now is the right time to do it rather than at the moment of a ceasefire or later on? Is this the moment of maximum leverage for Europe to do something like this?
I think so. Yes. I mean, the French now. To be fair, the French have sort of, or the Elysee has sort of coming around to the idea that maybe we should make this loan at the moment that there's a ceasefire. But there isn't a ceasefire, and if there's not a ceasefire, Ukraine is going to need the money to fight, and therefore let's give them the money to fight, and let's use that as leverage to bring Putin to the negotiating table. I personally don't think he'll come to the negotiating table and give a decent ceasefire to Ukraine, but this is one of the things that could do that, and particularly if it allows Ukraine to have a very good war chest. I mean, the other thing is that this would be sufficient to basically fund Ukraine for about 3 years, even if they don't get a penny from America. At the same time, we've seen the oil price fall to about $60 a barrel, which is absolutely wonderful. It's one of the great silver linings of Trump's tariff madness. It's terribly bad for Putin. If we could get it down to $50, I mean, and at the same time find a massive loan to Ukraine, then if you're sitting in the Kremlin, you're thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be in a really bad situation here. I'm not sure that I can outlast the Ukrainians in a war of attrition.
There's one issue that looms large, though, over any attempt to do anything with these frozen assets, which is that they they need to be, the sanctions that enable them to be frozen have to be renewed every 6 months, which means that at any moment, or no, in September or at any 6-month interval, an EU country, let's call it Hungary, could at a moment unfreeze those assets and then they're gone.
Yeah, that is a problem. There is a workaround. The workaround is that each country where the assets are sitting can freeze them under national law rather than under EU law. And they have discussed that. This is something that has been discussed for, well, at least a year it has been discussed, because the Hungarian issue is not a new one. I think they should probably bite the bullet and just do that and say that these are permanently frozen assets until and unless Russia agrees to pay reparations to Ukraine, which is the G7 position. The G7 position is that these assets will remain frozen until and unless Russia pays reparations. Now, so let's put in place the legal basis for doing that.
That may now be the G6 position, which is the slightly worrying thing. There's another, I mean, that's the heart of the plan, the legality, is the need to, is the independent tribunal that would need to then at some point rule that Russia owed reparations. Is that something that, again, Europe could do without the US? At the moment, it seems to be one can't really rely on the US as to be constructive in any part of this process.
Yeah, well, first of all, international law is very clear that if you invade a country and damage it, you owe them reparations. But of course, you then need to set up a mechanism. The legitimacy for setting up a tribunal is that the UN General Assembly, 2 and a bit years ago, passed a resolution calling for such a tribunal. The first step of that, a register of damages, has already been set up in The Hague, and last month, about 50 countries decided to start negotiations on creating a treaty to set up the tribunal. So I think you go ahead with or without the Americans, and you just bite the bullet. And I mean, they'll be on the wrong side of history if they decide that they don't want to support Ukraine, and we'll be on the right side of history if we manage to support Ukraine and do it successfully.
Well, I think Europe definitely needs, at this point, to do something to assert its geopolitical interest or show that it has some, that it's capable of acting in any capacity at all, it seems to me. So this seems to be a pretty good idea as a way of doing that.
Thank you very much, Simon.
So, we need something like this in Europe to show that we're.
I think we need something, and this is something that we can do almost unilaterally. So let's get on and do it.
There we are. I think at that point, then I will say thank you very much to Hugo, and that's for the end session.